Welcome, everyone, to another Reuters Newsmaker. I'm Axel Threlfall, editor-at-large based out of London. I am delighted to welcome Tony Blair back to Reuters, albeit virtually. We have, as always, lots to talk about. The news cycle has made very sure of that. I will kick off our conversation, but there will be plenty of time for your questions to Mr. Blair. So do start sending those through, and I will get to as many of those as I can. Now, this discussion, or at least where I'm going to kick it off, is pegged to a report published today by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change entitled China's Role in the World. The timing works well because, let's face it, China's growing assertiveness, it's growing combativeness, and how everyone else responds to that has a bearing on so much right now. And I think it's fair to say is probably the hottest issue in Western foreign policy as well, not only because of what it says about China, but because of what it says about so many governments trying to manage their own relationships with China. Tony Blair. Welcome. Back to Roy. Are they right?
I don't think for bad, but I think there is a new aggressiveness and assertiveness about China, which combined obviously with the questions that are rightly being asked of China as a result of the pandemic, lead people to a more hostile attitude towards China. And I think the interesting thing about the poll is it shows that this is a public opinion issue. It's not just a policymaker issue. But I think it's important to understand at the same time that there are things that we need a relationship with China for, not least trying to solve things like global pandemics, climate change, reflating the world economy, where to get in. I mean, really the purpose of the report is to say whatever attitudes are towards China, to get into a situation of hostility is not really sensible.
Sure. But do you think the days of viewing or hoping to view China as a partner or an accountable, responsible stakeholder in international affairs is over?
I think we're in a new era, yeah, for sure. And so what's really happened to two things. And one of them is completely justified, and the other is frankly difficult for us. The first is that China is now a risen power. We go through some of the statistics in the report, but you can see that enormous position China has in global supply chains, the size of its economy, increasingly the size of its military. For example, in the continent of Africa, it's the largest investor by a long way now. So you see the risen China, and that is, of course, completely justifiable. It's a country of over 1 billion people, ancient civilization. Why on earth shouldn't it be a power? But the second thing that's happened is that when people like myself first came to power just over 20 years ago, we assumed that as China evolved economically, it would evolve politically and in a more democratic and in a more open direction. Actually, what's happened in the last few years is the Chinese Communist Party has tightened its grip on China internally, and the Chinese government, as we've just been saying, has become much more assertive internationally. And therefore, confrontation with Western interests, obviously that has changed the whole dynamic.
All right, but okay, with that in mind then, how do we deal with China? It seems to me you think the US is probably, with its rather confrontational stance, getting it wrong right now. We need to find a balance. But others would argue that President Trump's confrontational stance, especially over trade, has produced results. Where's the balance here?
Right. So I mean, this is the essential question. And really what I'm saying is you need a strategic response, not just a series of ad hoc reactions to Chinese activity or power. And so I think you do have to be prepared to confront China where they're acting contrary to the interests and the values of the West, the international community. you have to be able to compete with China because what I say is you do have to reserve this space for confrontation, for cooperation rather. And the essential thing in my view is to be in a position where the West has built a strong enough set of alliances that we're able to handle China however and whatever direction China develops it.
I wonder, though, how those three ways, the cooperation, competition, and confrontation, work in practice. Is it possible to say cooperate with China on climate while at the same time confronting on trade, on human rights, on intellectual property? Surely China won't stomach that.
Well, I think it will if it knows it's met with a strong enough response. This is why it's important that America and Europe and our allies like Japan, India, that we stick together on this. China, one of the things we do in the presentation is we expose the fact that, yes, China is a big power, but it's not a bigger power than America. And if America and Europe are together, and as I say, we pull in other allies, China's going to have to take notice of that. So I think it is possible to say, look, on issues like climate change, we need to cooperate together, and we should cooperate together. We need to work out how we develop the science and technology to deal with the changing climate. On the other hand, where China is behaving either in the South China Sea or in other respects in a way that's contrary to our interests, we've got to be strong enough to be able to stand up to China. And that also, then I think the importance of that is that will play back into what will continue to be a very intense debate inside China. We often don't see these debates from the outside, but there's a big debate in China about should they engage with the West or should they try and compete and build an alternative power center almost as it were in opposition to the West. And I think the stronger we are and the clearer we are and the more strategic we are, the more likely it is that those people, I think the more sensible voices in China will say, yes, we've got to reform, we are going to be a big power, but we need to exercise that power responsibly. And we don't want to go into a sort of aggressive nationalism. I think those voices will be strengthened if we're strong enough.
Okay, well, let's take a specific example, Huawei. I'd be interested to hear your views, whether you think this is the perfect test case for these three ways of dealing with China. What Huawei policy best serves the UK's national interest, would you say, Tony? Is it pro-China or pro-US? We need to make a call, surely, on this.
I think we do need to make a call, and I think it's got to be pro-US in the end. So, I mean, look, it's a problem for us because, as you will know better than me, the fact is Huawei have an infrastructure that we need. It is already quite embedded. And the truth is it's a lot cheaper than the alternatives that have been developed up to now. And one of the extraordinary things about 5G is that the West has, in a way, just allowed this advantage, this superiority to be gained. But I think it's America feels very strongly about this, and they feel strongly for good enough reasons. So I think it's very hard for us. And I know the British government's trying to navigate its way out of a difficult situation here, but it's very hard for us not to be with the US on anything that touches US security.
So you're saying the UK government should be tougher with China than it is being regarding the Huawei?
Well, it's going to have to. It's what the UK government's trying to do is to restrict as far as possible it can the footprint, and then try and build for a different type of future. And I think they will try and do that. Whether they can do that successfully is quite an open question. But I don't think there's any doubt that ultimately the UK will want to be with America on security questions. Now, it also, of course, depends, because we should never confuse the Chinese people with the Chinese Communist Party. It also depends the degree to which China and its rulers also, take account of the fact that they're going to be operating in a much more challenging environment and also adapt their behavior. And one other thing I believe is incredibly important is that we don't lose sight of the need for engagement between people. So I am completely in favor, for example, of two-way flows of students from China to the West and back from the West to China. I think as much cultural engagement as you can possibly have is a good and a sound idea. Because one of the things we, again, explore in this paper is to say you can't treat war with the Soviet Union was tiny. It imported something like $200 million worth of goods. In 2018, the imports of America from China were $560 billion. But also because the Soviet Union was a forced collection of countries. Yep. China's one country. And it's an ancient civilization that is always going to be a big power in today's world.
All right, look, I'm going to one final piece on China, and then I want to move on. Lots of questions coming through on China as well, which we'll try and get to at the end. In your report, you talk about a Cold War light, and I imagine a lot of people are going to latch on to this phrase. Right now, though, we've got 3 US aircraft carrying the Pacific for the first time in years. The Chinese see that as provocation. There's a US-China trade standoff. Many people are going to look at this and say, look, we're already in a Cold War light with China. How long before that then graduates to a proper Cold War? And can it?
I think that just depends on which direction our leadership and their leadership want to take it. And that's why what I'm arguing for is sustained engagement with China. And that's a whole other topic, obviously, but where I think what is clear from this poll, but also from statements from Europe recently, despite what is happening, and you've just seen what's happened recently on the India-China border, I think it's possible to pull back, even from a light Cold War, and get into a better strategic relationship. But it needs working on, and it needs working on as a strategy, and as I say, not as a series of reactions, and with allies.
Yeah, in fact, you know, I'm going to bring in a question that's just come through because it specifically talks about the India-China dispute. And the question is this: why are Western democracies not coming down much more heavily on China as a result of what's been going on there?
Well, I think they are coming down quite hard on China, but the question is, where do you take it? And I think that the you know, in each one of these areas where you get the potential for confrontation, you are, I think, going to get a much tougher Western response in time to come. So I think, you know, wherever the issues of friction are, you will find a much tougher response. And actually, you know, the reaction of America and Europe to this border incident was strong. And I think, by the way, one of the things you're going to see is the West's relationship with India will strengthen significantly. And that is another long-term development. But, you know, in the end, you only have to look at the economic facts and figures and look at the size and the power of China to realize it's still important to have the ability to work with China where it's necessary to do so.
Yeah. All right. Move on just generally to leadership. We've talked about leadership and collective leadership, and we've talked about the US. My question is this: does the US, well, is the US in a position to lead on a lot of these things right now? Does it even want to lead, I guess, is the important question. Has it perhaps lost its desire to influence the global agenda for the time being?
And right now, I think there is a move towards a more isolationist US position, but these things change. And it's not in the US interest, it's not remotely in the United States interest not to be engaged and a key player in the world. And I think, you know, if you look beneath the rhetoric, I think America will remain engaged. It's bound to, because its own interests are bound up with that. So if you look, for example, at if you see the way the Chinese footprint through One Belt, One Road, for example, in Africa, you know, obviously there's a huge diplomatic and economic effort. How is America going to respond to that? It's got to respond to it by building alliances. And so it's not that they're doing that in order to relegate the interests of their own country. They're doing it because it is in the interests of their own country. And I am sure in time, with this administration or indeed a new administration, this will happen.
All right, well, let me ask you.
is where I think President Trump wasn't wrong to put this on the table. I think, frankly, most Europeans supported that. No, where there are unfair trade practices, you should seek to change them. But I think a lurch back into protectionism, big mistake for the world, really is. And I think, by the way, it's just not going to happen. I mean, I know that there is at the moment, there is a reaction and movement against globalization. But the single most important thing always to realize about globalization is it's driven in the end by people. It's not driven by government simply. It's driven by people and their ability to cooperate across boundaries of race and nation and indeed culture today. So I think if we went back into protectionism, we would all lose from that.
Okay. Would a Biden presidency be better able to rally a common Western stand against China? Or do you think what we're seeing now, and I think both draws nearer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's basically right. You'll probably get, I think, more or less a sort of competition in the acknowledgement that China and its power has to be dealt with in a tough way by America. And I suspect people will be competing with each other on that in the presidential campaign.
It's a big question, this, but is the UN and some of these other multilateral bodies redundant now?
They're not redundant, but they do get affected by this dispute. And one of the things that's very difficult about international governance is if your two biggest players in the international arena are in confrontation with each other, it's tough, frankly, to make those institutions work effectively.
What do you think of, what do you make of, I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here, the allegations made in John Bolton's book, which says Vladimir Putin, for example, views Donald Trump as easy to outsmart. He talks of being stunningly uninformed. I mean, it lays bare, does it not, the simplicity of global decision-making from Washington. How worried, if this is indeed true, how worried should we be by that?
Look, my own politics without trying to sort out someone else's, but look, ultimately, whatever people, whether they're pro-President Trump or anti-President Trump, there is an inherent resilience and strength in America. If you leave aside all the stuff that goes on in the politics, that strength is not going to disappear. Now, would I like to see America much more active on the world stage? Yes. Building alliances with others? Yes, I think that they can and should and must do more on that because it's so important for the West and for its values and interests. But I don't know whether the book's correct or not. I can't really comment.
All right. It must be fascinating, though, to you, whether it is or not. Stuff like that from about world leaders.
Well, what you realize about international engagement and politics at a certain level is that in the end, it isn't about the snippets of conversation or the stories about that give the color to particular meetings. What's the actual policy and what difference does it make? Anyway,
let's talk about
my best way of avoiding that.
No, I had to give it a shot. Let's talk about the response to the pandemic, because I know your institute has done a lot of work with governments on this. When we look at the balance, this balance between protecting,
got the balance right are the people that recognize you have to lock down fast, and the people who will get the easing of the lockdown right are the people who realize you have to do it, recognizing you're going to be living with this disease for some time and therefore need the right, as I call it, infrastructure of containment in order to make sure that you can ease responsibly. But the problem, I mean, the essential dilemma for policymakers about COVID-19 is this: it's serious enough that you don't want it, right? So you and I will both know people who've had it badly. Probably I certainly do know people who've died from it. So you know enough about it to know you don't want it. On the other hand, it's not the bubonic plague, and you can't shut the enormous damage done to your economy for a long period of time. Yeah. So in the end, you're not, as it were, it's not about lives versus livelihoods. It's calculating the risk, because society is going to be enormous. And I really, really worry about that. So I'm in favor of those governments that just are effective and competent all the way through. Shut down fast, get mass testing in place, yep, get the lockdown eased as quickly as you can, but with the containment infrastructure in place.
So I imagine you would not put the US and the UK in that category.
Well, we've been badly hit, both of us.
But what about the response? Is the widespread criticism of the UK's government's response justified?
I think even those UK government members you talk to privately would admit that the lockdown response was too slow. Yeah. So and it's one thing you learn when you leave office. It's a darn sight easier to give the advice than take the decision. So you've just got to caveat it with that. But no, I think we didn't lock down fast enough. But I think the thing that we are missing now, which is my constant plea, is to do testing on a mass scale and build the rest of what I call the containment strategy. That means you can, for example, open up schools, get businesses back to work with some reasonable hope that where you get outbreaks, and you will get outbreaks, you've got the things in place that allow you to squash them fast.
I've heard you talk about this. We've seen some rapid change happen in the private sector in response to this. Do you think, how optimistic are you we can see similar change happen in the public sector? And look, I know things happen much more slowly there, but is this at least providing a context for governments, for policymakers to do the right thing going forward?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really good point. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is in a crisis, in a sort of wartime atmosphere of crisis, you can get government to work in a way which is much faster and often much more effective. And the question really is how you take that process of decision making and that relief of sort of over bureaucracy, and you take that into peacetime, as it were. And for example, just in the way that we have used technology within our healthcare system, I mean, we have done probably more in the last 10 weeks than we've done the last 10 years. So, how you do that, and then, I mean, personally, I think the single biggest challenge is how you take the technology change that is possible today and you run with that at a much greater speed in the private sector and in the public sector. Mm-hmm. So I think in education, for example, there are things that we have learned during the course of this crisis that we could again bring into our education system and run it better. The government, at the end of this, my view is that all those things that government should have been doing before the crisis, all the necessary reforms are going to be there after it, yep, but they should be accelerated.
Do you think, though, generally, and it's a big question, this, but the world, missed a perfect opportunity to actually pull together, realize our common humanity, and come out of this with something better?
Yeah, and of course. I mean, look, what's absolutely extraordinary is that we haven't had the degree of global coordination that was obviously necessary. I mean, around, we're getting there on vaccines, but pretty slowly and with difficulty. We still don't have, by the way, a proper and fair distribution mechanism, because there will be all hell to pay if the rich world gets the vaccines and it isn't properly distributed. distributed to the developing world. And then on the sharing of data, clinicians have been working together, but governments have been, there's been a hesitation about governments working together in the way that is absolutely necessary. And I'm sure that, what we need to do coming out of this is to create some institutional capacity at a global level to be able to predict pandemics far better and also to be able to deal with them.
Yeah, all right. Look, I've got a wary eye on the time. We've got lots and lots of questions coming through, and I do want to get to those in a few minutes. There's a few other bits and pieces I want to ask you about. And I want to come on to this, a little bit provocative, but look, over 40,000 deaths in the UK, many more by some counts. If you'd presided, Tony, over that kind of death toll, would you have felt obliged to resign? Would you have thought about resignation?
Look, I don't think you can really talk in those terms. Would I have been disappointed and anxious about the situation? Yes, of course. And look, there'll be a time afterwards to go back over and see what might have been done differently or better. But I think the likelihood is a globally open country like Britain was always going to be hit hard with this. And I'm actually more sympathetic to the problems going into the lockdown, because I think there was a lot of, uncertainty at that point about the disease and what it was like and what was necessary. So I'm much more much more understanding of that. I think what won't be acceptable now is not to get the easing right.
Yeah. When you and I last met, you made an impassioned, it was just before the election, you made an impassioned plea at Reuters headquarters in London, not to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, basically saying that the choices are pretty stark. Given what's happened in between, the pandemic, the response, the reaction to the government's response, the way Keir Starmer of the Labour Party is now stepping up, has this whole...
You've got a leader of the Labour Party that looks as if he could be Prime Minister. I mean, I'm not saying, and Keir will know this as well as anyone, there's a long way to go. But he's made a very good start. He's made good decisions inside the Labour Party. He's performing well. He's obviously a highly intelligent and capable guy. So, no, of course, that's been a big change. And if we carry on like that and then develop the right policy agenda, which he's got time to do, then we'll have a fighting chance for sure. And at least we're back on the pitch, which is a welcome
and
change.
I imagine you speak to Keir Starmer, among others. Is the morale in the party back up? I mean, the culture has been, probably still is, pretty toxic, but is the morale coming back up?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the culture is a lot less toxic. I think people are basically wanting and willing to give Keir a chance. I mean, everyone knows it's a difficult fight. We've had a terrible defeat. We've gone in what might be completely the wrong direction in recent years, but he's making a good fist of it, and he deserves support.
Just to come back to Trump and China, how tough does the Trump-Xi era make things here in the UK? We can't comfortably, as we've talked about, it's hard to ally comfortably with either side. We've isolated ourselves from Europe to boot. More, I guess, lonely Britain right now than global Britain. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's going to be difficult, but I mean, it's difficult for all countries, frankly, to be caught in this fight. But I think, in the end, the UK will be with America on issues that touch security and values and essential interests. But the point is, we also do a lot of trade and business with China, and we'll want to keep that going. And it's in no one's interest for China. For the world to fall into two blocks, I think would be really unfortunate. And that's why I think it's not a very popular thing to say right now, by the way, but that's why I think you've got to keep that space for cooperation, even if you clearly on issues of security are going to be with our principal allies.
All right, look, I've got a few other bits and pieces, but as I said, lots of questions coming through. We've only got about 15 minutes to go. So let me come to some of these questions. And one of them is how you view the crisis of the social democratic parties in Europe. And in the context in which we've been speaking, this idea that there's a bit of a vacuum, that the Europeans might come in as leaders in their own right. Is it possible for the social democrats in Europe to reverse the trend?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible, but it's a good question. And in my view, the only way that the Social Democrats are going to revive is if they realize that the battle is not about social democratic values. Most people accept that you want to live in a just society where there's equality of opportunity and you help those that are without. The challenge for is that the single biggest challenge is this 21st century technology revolution. It is the 21st century equivalent to the industrial revolution of the 19th century. And for social democrats, you've got to understand it. You've got to realize it's going to change everything. And you've got to stop talking in terms of things like, if you have a transport debate that's around, do you bring back British Rail or not? Do you nationalize the railways? I mean, completely irrelevant. And the question is, what is the transport policy for the 21st century going to look like, where you're going to have driverless cars, probably electric vehicles, and where you've got high-speed rail capability? So how are you going to change completely the way that your transport infrastructure is built? And you can go through literally healthcare, education. What social democrats must not become are small c conservatives just opposing the changes in the world. We've got to lead the change and make it fair. And that's, in my view, if the social democrats do that, then they will revive. If they don't, then the risk is that the conservative parties actually take up that mantle.
Yeah. All right. Look, we said we'd talk about populism and nationalism as well. Here's a question. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, they are linked very loosely in some people's eyes, their response to the coronavirus, the high death rates in their countries. Do you see good old-fashioned competence coming back into vogue with voters after all of this? Are people tiring of flamboyant populists now?
Yeah, this is the great unknown, actually. I mean, and you've got to be careful of what you want to be the case, believing that it is going to be the case. So I think, yes, that what will happen after this crisis is that people realize the governments that dealt with it well, looked at the evidence, went according to reasonable, rational policy making, tried to bring people together, and were effective. That's what I think and I hope. But the thing I always say to people about this crisis is that it's so unusual and so deep that everything that was there before COVID is going to be there afterwards, but more vivid and more intense. And that will probably include populism, because the one thing you don't know yet is how is this economic rebound going to go? And will you come out of this crisis with millions of people, and often the most vulnerable, in a situation where their jobs are not going to come back and they're a long way off getting retrained for new ones? So your business, my institute, we've got almost 300 people working for us. We've been able to repurpose very easily. We use the technology. We can still work very easily. Many people are going to be out of work and in business. I hope that the evidence-based center ground works.
Lots and lots of questions still on China coming through, and I want to come back to this subject and nationalism. Countries not working through multilateral channels, inward-looking mentality. But it seems to me that given China's stance, it's used the pandemic very well, if you like, to its strength. It's the pandemic's given China a bit of a shot in the arm when it comes to the way it's put the West on the back foot. Is that a fair way of looking at it? Are they being cleverer than others at playing this to their advantage?
I think that there are sort of people on behalf of the Chinese government that want to say that. I don't think so myself. And I think what our poll shows is that public opinion's got a pretty clear fix on the whole thing. No, I think it's really that, of course, China has dealt with the disease effectively, and there's no doubt about it. It's got the control mechanisms to deal with it effectively. But have they? they come out of this with their global reputation enhanced, I think what's interesting about the poll, and the findings surprised me, not in relation to the US, they surprised me in relation to France and Germany and the UK. Well, I think you'd have to say no. The people are very well aware that this did start with China and that China was slow to alert the world to it.
Black Lives Matter is something we haven't talked about, and there are some questions coming through on that as well. How a number of them really to this idea of how you would have handled this situation and what practical policy steps you would have taken. So there's that question I'd like you to respond to, but also this one for being implicated, hundreds of years ago.
Look, I think you've got to be really careful of sort of running back over your history continually. In my view, the central thing is to recognize that there's a just cause here, and the cause is structural racism and inequality, and you've got to deal with it, but you've got to deal with it with policy that works. So that's looking at how companies change their practices, how we become more aware of how Black people perceive how they are treated and how they actually objectively are treated in many cases. And the most reasonable people, I mean, I had a discussion between a couple of Black footballers on the TV the other day, and I thought the way that they did it was just so reasonable. I mean, they basically described their experiences, said we've made a lot of progress, but we still got a long way to go, and we need to get the policies that are actually going to make a difference. And I think that's the right way of doing it. I'm not, and the people who then get on a cause like that and then wrench it into ways that involve rioting and lawlessness, I mean, all they do is undermine the cause. So I think, it's like anything else. It's an inflection point where things that have been building up for a long period of time have just sort of come to they found a focal point around the death of George Floyd, and what's happened then is that it has sparked a moment of realization. You got to deal with it. But the important thing is dealing with it, not simply, protesting about it.
Yeah. Okay. Only a few minutes to go, but there's plenty more that we want to ask you. I wondered, and when we decided, when I thought about reaching out for this newsmaker, it was really because I thought, look, there are issues that we're all focused on, and I wonder how to what extent we're taking our eye off the ball when it comes to a number of other very, very critical issues. Iran, Moscow, Syria, Libya, some of these issues. Is there a danger that we have done that? I know there are people out there now. I'm getting lots of questions on the Israel annexation, for example, a very timely point. But what worries you most about us focusing on this one thing so intensely and forgetting other stuff?
Yeah, no, because the rest of the world goes on, and these things are very critical. I mean, I hope very much that the plan to annex the Jordan Valley does not go ahead. I think it would be taken as a sign that the peace process was over. That's important. Iran continues to be important. Libya, I think, needs a lot of focus at the moment. I mean, its future essentially is being decided at the moment in a fight between Russia on the one side and Turkey on the other. But the destabilization effect of Libya on the Sahel group of countries, and then the countries to the south of the Sahel that are now finding that terrorism is spreading into their countries. No, that's also a huge problem for sure. Yeah, there is a danger of this, but this is where I think if the world was operating on a more coordinated basis, you would find the space to deal with these other questions, because it's not as if governments should have the bandwidth to deal with more than one thing at a time.
Specifically on Israel, of course, some would say, this is sort of nationalism writ large, inward-looking mentality, thumbing their nose at their core allies because it has the backing of the US. And the terrible precedents this sets elsewhere: China in the South China Sea, China in India, Russia in Crimea. Are these the dangers here?
Well, I think just very specifically on the annexation, freeze any notion of annexation. until there'd been a proper discussion around the peace plan that the Americans launched. And, you know, this is those of us who've been dealing for years and years and years with this Israeli-Palestinian issue are just incredibly frustrated at the missed opportunities we keep getting. We keep failing to take those opportunities in order to move the situation forward. But I think in other, I mean, each arena is different. The reason I single out Libya is that I think right now it is in a very, very dangerous situation. And I think some focus from Western governments would be very sensible.
Couple of other bits and pieces. Will the pandemic accelerate or slow progress on the climate change fight, in your opinion?
No, I think people will still. I think what people will think is climate change is its own problem. It's still a major problem. I hope that we get to the idea also that there is a chance to speed up the development of the science and technology. That's the only way through climate change. And one of the things that is going to be most important, and I constantly try and emphasize this to people, just remember the population of Africa is going to double in the next 30 years. It's going to go from over 1 billion to over 2 billion. These African nations should and will want to and will develop. They're going to be building transport links, airports, airlines. They're going to be building power stations because they need electricity. What Europe should do on climate change is great, and we should do it. But, you know, I always say to people when we're debating the third runway at Heathrow, which is probably off the agenda anyway now, but, right, you know, whether we have a third runway at Heathrow or not is not going to determine the future of the climate. What will is whether that part of the developing world that needs to develop most and should develop most can be helped to do so sustainably. And that's the number one challenge.
And by the way, a number of questions from global asset managers in the sustainable space asking what you'd want to see us doing with respect to sustainable investing globally. And I guess that's very much part and parcel of what you've just been
really encourage that we should be doing everything that we can to stimulate what will ultimately be a chain that goes from investment in new technology to the development and implementation of that technology, because that's the only way you're going to. You can't deal with climate change by telling the developing world not to develop. You can only do it by showing how they can develop sustainably and helping them.
I'm gonna finish where we started with your report on China, and I wonder. My question is this: is this report born from a fear of what will happen if we don't come up with a strategy to handle China, or does it reflect an optimism on your part that were we collectively to settle on a strategy, we could either make the relationship work better or keep China in check?
Well, it's a fear. The report is really based on a fear that we won't engage with China strategically. We'll just do a series of sporadic reactions to their actions. That it's absolutely necessary that we react in a strategic way. And I suppose it also reflects an optimism if we do it, that China is not like the old Soviet Union. It's a powerful country. It's always going to be and remain a powerful country. And if we have the right measure of the different elements of what we need to do in respect of China, we will end up being able to push back where we need to push back, but to work together with China where it's going to be absolutely necessary to do so. So I know it's a kind of third way that I'm articulating there, but I honestly think it is the right thing to do, because I think if we end up borrowing an analogy from the Cold War and going into a state of hostility, I think it will hugely impede the world's ability to deal with its problems.
Actually, I'm going to ask you one final question, because, of course, I've been reminded now that we haven't mentioned Brexit at all, and I was kind of doing that intentionally, Tony. But here's a very quick thought on Brexit. Has the pandemic made you reassess? Does it, by comparison, feel like a little local difficulty, a political problem, but not a crisis, something that we can figure out and move on from?
I'm afraid you're never going to convince me that Brexit's anything other than a total and complete disaster, I'm afraid, for Britain, and I'm very sad about it. But I also, by the way, accept it's happening. We should make it happen as well as we possibly can. But here's the single most important thing about Brexit now. You've got to get the trade deal, however you can manage it, which you can in the end, and it should take whatever time is necessary to do it. Let's hope we can do it before the time runs out at the end of the year. But then you've got to look at areas where Britain can cooperate with Europe and build a relationship, even outside the formal structures of the European Union. Build it around defense and security and foreign policy, build it where we got massive common interests, build it around energy policy, things like climate change, which has been discussing now, build it around issues to do with development, build it around education, build it around technology. Search for the areas where we can sensibly, in mutual interest, work with Europe. Brexit's happened. Obviously, I deeply regret it, but you've got to try and make the best of it now. But what would be a huge mistake for us is to think that we can change by Brexit our legal relationship with Europe. What we can't change is our geography or our history or the future necessity of working with Europe.
Yeah. All right. Look, I'm going to stop us there. Tony, we've covered an awful lot of ground, so I want to thank you for your time. Thank you to everyone out there watching this Newsmaker for your questions. We'll watch this space very, very carefully and all of the issues, of course, Tony, that we've talked about. Tony Blair, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Axel. Thank you, everyone.